Hi, everybody. Um, in lieu of a lecture, I wanted to give you some context for understanding the the culture in which the woman of color takes place. Um, Olivia Fairfield, while a fictional heroine, as far as we know, was nonetheless not the only um, example of a biracial woman who dealt with some of the challenges accompanying that in the 18th century. Um, in the case of this portrait, one of the most well known biracial British noble women uh, when, was named Dido Elizabeth Belle. Um, and we can we know a few things about her. Number one, a biography of her life is the source material for the film Belle, which is listed next on our syllabus. And I would encourage you to watch it if you are able. I know it's available to rent for streaming for maybe like $3. And I think it's also probably available for free somewhere if you dig around. So, there is enough information known about, like women of color in the British Atlantic and colonial environment in the 18th century. I'm going to use this painting as a way to talk about how their position was understood. This is a painting that at first might seem playful, like it's the two women playing together. And it doesn't appear to you immediately that the women would be related to one another, and they are. They're cousins. Lady Elizabeth Murray is the white woman in pink on the right-hand side, holding a book. And to the left, we have her cousin, Dido Elizabeth Belle. Dido was a daughter of a wealthy nobleman and was biracial, grew up in Scotland and England, and eventually lived the kind of life where she took care of her elder relatives for a little while until they passed away, and then she married and had children, and she had an inheritance that was left to her, and died in her 40s, I think. So she had a relatively rich life, not without problems and challenges, of course. And when you look at this portrait, you can kind of see it divided in half vertically. We can start with some of the very obvious traditional British portraiture on the right-hand side, and then we will talk about how Dido is represented. Lady Elizabeth is facing the viewer of the painting directly. She appears to be sitting on a bench reading. Behind her is some kind of British-looking tree, probably an oak. Her hair is done up in what would have been the style of the time. So she is associated with being in a park-like setting, sitting on a bench, so something refined in nature, and also literacy, reading a book. She also, and if you've ever studied film, you're familiar with this, the gazing directly at the viewer is a gesture of equality, confrontation, just regarding that person from the place where you are. You are not necessarily above or below them, but you have the confidence to look directly out at them. So then we look over to the left at Dido. You will see that she is not seated. She is, it looks like, running off. It's not easy to tell what that hand gesture is with Lady Elizabeth. Is she pushing Dido off to go somewhere? Is she touching her playfully? The gesture and the physical affection does show that there is a connection between the two. Dido is sort of bent over, her head is inclined, her head is looking to the side, and she is sort of looking up at us. If you have ever read some of the race and ethnic studies essays that come out about how women of color are sometimes treated in media, often exoticized, sexualized, treated in a way that foregrounds physicality. In the case of Dido here, obviously this is not necessarily a seductive pose. We do see more of her body than we see of Lady Elizabeth's. You note that her dress is shown as being a little bit closer to her body than the sort of wider ball gown that Lady Elizabeth is wearing. She's bent to the side, and she's sort of looking playfully at the viewer. And she is sort of positioned to be shy and reticent rather than confrontational and direct. You see that she is not associated with books and reading. She is associated with the beautiful bouquet of natural flowers and branches and fruits, the sort of cornucopia that she is running around with. She does not have her hair done in an English style. She has her hair up in a silk wrap with a feather to the back of it. She would have looked stylish, but she also would have looked. It would have represented her race as well. If you look at the landscape behind her, I find that especially interesting. Again, to the right, there's a bench in a park and a tree. To the left, there's this sort of unknown, distant vista and landscape. There's, buildings and sunrise and sunset off to the far side. There's a bridge, there's trees, there's, a long, long journey to get to whatever that distant city is. And even if that distant city is Edinburgh or London, it still shows that, Dido is associated with leaving and travel and movement, and the world as opposed to the domestic sphere. So when you read The Woman of Color and you hear Olivia Fairfield interacting in a kind of Anglo-white society, think about this painting. Which women were considered the default women for courtship narratives in Britain in the 18th and 19th centuries. The way that Lady Elizabeth is presented as if to a future husband, I think is intentional. The way that Olivia is presented, possibly with the assumption that she will be seen as beautiful, but also as someone who looks like she is part of a fantasy. There's the distant city, there's the exotic fruits and flowers. In some ways, she is like a character, and they present Lady Elizabeth as like a person, even though they're both people. But that is the way that certain kinds of art were used to defining whiteness and to exoticizing blackness. But the people who Olivia circulates with, she would be sitting in drawing rooms with paintings of people like Elizabeth, sitting with people who look like Elizabeth. Every face in the room is going to look like, the same kind of 18th century characters we've encountered. And so entering that world through her eyes, I think the readers of her time would have seen some of the problems in themselves. I think some of the readers of the time might not have thought about race much at all if they had very limited experience. And hopefully, the character would have been compelling and sympathetic and interesting, and women would have possibly chatted with one another and said, if we met someone like Olivia, I hope that we would welcome her. Or, maybe that's too idealistic of me. I had one more thing. Well, it's okay. Yeah, so as you read it, think about courtship narratives. Also think about some of the other books that you've read, women in the novels that we've read. Female Quixote comes to mind as an example of another novel centered on women, that gives women some criticism. We're not criticizing Olivia in this book. We are criticizing, we the reader, how she is treated by others, who is welcoming to her, who is not welcoming to her. She is the character through which we see things, just like Arabella in the Female Quixote. We learn what kind of people the other characters are through the way they treat Arabella, the people who mock her, the people who try to take advantage of her, versus Glanville, who supports her and cares for her and really wants her to be happy, and he's trying very hard. So as you read The Woman of Color, try to think about what this novel is doing with the kind of courtship narratives that you've been exposed to so far in this class. Think about what kinds of different descriptions you see of Olivia, what kinds of interactions, aggressions, microaggressions she faces as she circulates socially, what her perspective on race and ethnicity is. Nothing is ever simple, and hers isn't either. And yeah, and I'm really excited to learn what you think.